here today with Robert Raich, who's a prolific cannabis attorney. You've taken two cannabis cases to the Supreme Court and have done a lot of work for the cannabis movement. So it's really an honor to be joined by you today. Thank you so much. So really briefly, can you just introduce yourself and tell our audience a little more about your role in this world and how you got involved in the cannabis industry?
Well, yes, my name is Robert Raich. I'm an attorney, but really what I try to do is advocate for good laws. The reason I'm focusing on this cannabis issue is because prohibition is an absolute abject failure no matter how you look at it. It's just so obvious it has achieved none of its stated alleged goals. No one's only made them worse. And has at the same time made life a whole lot better for some of the least desirable segments of our society. So you have to wonder, if a policy doesn't achieve any of its stated goals, but has achieved other things, maybe it was those other things that were the goal all along, such as repression, taking away individual liberties, etc. So the tip of the spear in trying to end this repression is the medical cannabis issue. And on that basis, what I have been doing is been spending a lot of my time over the last many years trying to promote safe access to medical cannabis, but really with the overriding goal of ending repression against individuals and an overreach of the police state. You asked how I began. You know, as an undergraduate, back in the late 1970s in Massachusetts, I had a part-time job working for Massachusetts NORML to lobby the legislature for what we would now call a medical cannabis bill. That was the beginning of it, but it really wasn't until the early 90s, when I had become a lawyer and moved to California, that I was able to get in on the ground floor of this movement. You know, a lot of people think it started with the passage of Proposition 215 in 1996. But, you know, Prop 215 didn't spring from the head of Zeus already fully formed. There's a lot of work that went on for years before that. We passed two bills through the legislature that were both vetoed by the governor. We passed a resolution through the legislature first. And it was only Prop 215 that we finally changed the laws without having to go through the legislature. Having been involved at the first step of that escalator all along, I've just been riding it up ever since, to the point now where we are really a legitimate industry, and I'm happy to be here to try to shape it as well. Awesome.
Well, thank you so much for the years and years of work that's allowed the industry to get to where it is today. I'm wondering, as a lot of entrepreneurs in New York, which is where I'm based, are getting into what they see as the ground floor of this industry, what's some advice that you have for aspiring cannabis entrepreneurs?
You know, if what you're trying to do is create a good policy, have a long-term horizon. Try to work in the direction so that we are all going to be happy a few decades from now, a few generations from now. I think if we don't put a lot of effort in right now to moving in the correct direction, you know, we will find ourselves eventually nowhere near where we would ideally want to be. At the very beginning right now, moving off in the wrong direction is still kind of close to where we are right now. But just like if you remember vectors from your math classes, a vector, once it goes out farther, if they're going in two different directions, you're really widely far apart. So it is important, I think, for people who want to get into this industry and have a long-term time horizon to be doing everything we can to move us in the correct direction right now. Another thing I think that's important is to really have the interests of the ultimate consumers in mind, whether they be patients or for even recreational, other consumers of cannabis. It really all is based upon that. And I think people who enter this industry because their goal is to be capitalists and just to become rich or something are really not doing a good service for our industry, for our movement, much less for the people who we rely upon for everything. And for that reason, if that's what your goal is, you're not really doing a good service for yourself either. So I think we've got to keep our eye on the ball and what's really important.
Awesome, awesome. That's great advice.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, what's a key mistake or failure that you've learned from in the cannabis industry?
I think the biggest lesson I learned was not to try to bring about change in the marijuana laws through the court system. Sadly, they just have other priorities and are willing to work completely contrary to their own recent precedents if the issue involves cannabis. You know, I took, as you mentioned in your introduction, 2 cases to the U.S. Supreme Court. The second one, the Gonzalez versus Raich case, involved the Constitution, very basic questions, specifically Congress's power under the Commerce Clause to pass the Controlled Substances Act. We used what was at the time then 2 recent opinions from the U.S. Supreme Court dealing with the Commerce Clause issue. We were making conservative arguments because that's who was on the court. The majority was conservative justices who had just recently ruled that Congress didn't have authority under the Commerce Clause to pass certain sections of the Violence Against Women Act and the Gun-Free School Zones Act. Well, it seemed on that basis the Controlled Substances Act had even less to do with commerce than, say, guns, and had absolutely no connection to interstate activity, unlike, say, guns. So, if anything, our arguments would have been stronger, and we should have had the same kind of 5-4 victory in the Supreme Court. What we got was 3 justices in that case who agreed with us, but Justices Scalia and Kennedy, when the issue involved marijuana, were willing to break with their own recent precedents on our issue. Justice Scalia wrote a concurring opinion that doesn't make any sense. I defy anybody to read his opinion and explain what it means. I think it has something to do with the necessary and proper clause, but you have no conception by reading that opinion what standard he would be using or what really he was trying to argue. Justice Kennedy didn't even grace us with a concurring opinion to explain why he voted one way in the Lopez and Morrison decisions, the rape and the guns decision, and a different way when it came to marijuana. So on that basis, I realized that for really political or social reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with the safety or efficacy of cannabis, that the courts were not the proper forum to go through in order to try to change these laws. Instead, the way is to try to change legislation or to go through administrative procedures. The people are just way ahead of the politicians on this one, and even they are ahead of a majority of judges. So that's the advice. I wouldn't recommend at this point going through the court system. Eventually, things will probably change, but if somebody was telling me right now they're trying to change the cannabis laws, I'd say to try to promote good public policy by promoting good public relations, getting the people on board, and eventually the politicians and then the courts will follow. That's really the way to change things now, I'm afraid. I wish I'd known that earlier on and wouldn't have wasted some effort trying to take 2 cases to the U.S. Supreme Court. Look, it wasn't as if we were making crazy off-the-wall arguments. As I mentioned, in one case, in both cases actually, we had 3 justices who agreed with us. Right. But you need a majority. Right. So that's what it taught me. That was not the way to try to change the law.
Got it. Before we get into the next question, I was wondering, I'm getting a little static on the microphone, so would you mind just unplugging the headset and we'll just go without the headset for the rest of the. All right.
Hear me now?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great.
So what are you excited about for the next year in the cannabis industry?
You know, I think we will have additional states who will come on board through their legislatures passing full legalization of recreational marijuana. I'd like to think about 12 months from now, that will happen. If you extend it on to maybe 18 months from now, I think we'll have at least 4 additional states that will pass recreational marijuana laws through the ballot measures in those states. We can anticipate additional states coming on board with respect to medical cannabis. And what I am optimistic about in the next, say, 12 months, 18 months, is that the federal government, through the Obama administration, may continue to take small, little steps towards making cannabis more available to people who need it. I said I was optimistic. I wouldn't necessarily be betting that would happen because, frankly, Obama and his administration have been flip-flopping all over, back and forth, several times. He's only been in office 6.5 years, and they've been all over the map on this issue. He's been the president who's been the very worst president we've ever had for medical cannabis, worse than Clinton or Bush ever were. On the other hand, he's also been the president and the best president. And here, talking right now, you know, in June of 2015, we're at one of these times when we're in a relatively good period. And we have been moving in that trajectory for approximately 22 months since August of 2013. So I'd like to think and hope we'll continue in that regard. I would like to see things, for example, like Congress passing another rider on some appropriations bills to prohibit the federal government from spending money to thwart the will of the people in various ways. I would like to hope that the federal government will end the monopoly on NIDA cannabis, National Institute of Drug Abuse cannabis, for research purposes. I would like to think that the Justice Department will just completely drop a number of cases that have been still hanging on since before August of 2013, some forfeiture cases, some criminal prosecutions, some appeals. You know, those are the kinds of things that could be done without even the stroke of a pen, for Pete's sake. They could just be done if somebody, you know, in the proper place in the federal government decided to change. So I'm optimistic that these things may happen. However, I'm really confident that more states will come on board when we leave it to the people to actually give us good policy. And on that basis, I feel, you know, that certainly the longer and medium-term prognoses are really good for ending some of this injustice in society.
Awesome. What are some of your concerns for the next year or 18 months for the cannabis industry?
You know, some of the biggest concerns I've got have to do with a tendency to over-regulate when it comes to allowing recreational cannabis or recreational marijuana or medical cannabis. You know, I realize our polling has consistently shown that voters like regulation. But, you know, all regulation doesn't make sense. You can have really asinine regulations that don't help anybody. They're not good for the patients, for the consumers. They do nothing for the government, do absolutely nothing to promote public safety. But they're regulations only for the sake of regulating, which, you know, only makes things more complicated for everybody, more expensive for everybody, gives more power to the government, serves no useful purpose. So I see a tendency among people, even some people on our side of the debate, so when it comes to regulating, just to have a knee-jerk reaction to do too much of it or to do it in stupid ways. So I think one of the big risks we've got is to avoid regulations that don't make sense. Granted, we want regulations. You don't want people selling to kids in the schoolyards, etc. But you also don't want regulations that say, I'll give you one example, have opaque packaging on edibles. The argument goes, we must protect children from seeing what's inside an edible lest they think it's a candy or something. Yeah, but then on the other hand, as a patient or a consumer, you might like to actually see what you're about to obtain before putting it into your own body.
Certainly.
And if you've got children, keep your medicine out of reach of children or something like that in an age-appropriate way, just like you do with your other medicines. That's one example among scores more I could mention that I deal with all the time for regulations that don't make sense. That's one of the things that I think we need to be careful about. Another thing I worry about a lot is that the tide could turn against us. Right now we're in a good period. The momentum is clearly on our side, and every indication is that it will remain so. However, things could change. I remember back when Len Bias died. For people who don't remember, he was a college basketball player, a star. He'd just been drafted by the Boston Celtics. That night after the draft, he died from an overdose of cocaine. And that started, really, the more modern war on drugs under the Reagan administration. Just continued on. Democrats and Republicans alike were trying to outdo each other to see who could be more of a drug warrior. So what I worry about is there will be some other tragic accident, and that could cause a backlash. Some famous person's kid could be dabbing and have some kind of accident. I mean, who knows what it might be, but something like that could happen. So it's imperative on us to take this ball while we've got it and run it as far down the field as we possibly can, because things may change. They might change suddenly. We won't know when ahead of time, but we've got to be ready and be glad, because for whatever we've done, never be satisfied, because we don't know what will happen in the future. So we've got to use what we've got now, which is all we know, the present, and make sure we're doing as much as possible to change these unjust laws now.
Along those lines, how can people who love cannabis better serve the movement to end prohibition?
There are a lot of really good organizations out there. You can contribute to Marijuana Policy Project, Americans for Safe Access, Drug Policy Alliance, Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, others. They're good organizations. So one thing anybody can do is to write a check and contribute to organizations like that. Not everybody can. You can also volunteer. If you're a student, Students for Sensible Drug Policy is a great organization. You have NORML in various cities and states around the country with chapters. You could certainly get involved and work with them. It's real easy on the computer to like something, to hit a thumbs up, to post something, a comment, whatever. That's all well and good, but it really, I don't think, has as much of an impact as getting out there hands-on and volunteering some way that you can. If you live in a state or a local jurisdiction that has a ballot measure of some sort, and go on out there and work on that with every ability you've got to try to pass a good law. These are kinds of things you can do. Another thing, by the way, I think that it's helpful if you are a cannabis consumer to be willing to tell your family and your friends about that, to come out of the closet, so to speak. I think if your grandparents, your aunts and uncles, etc., know that you yourself are a responsible, productive member of society, but still consume cannabis, it is a way to take away some of the prejudice, the preconceptions, the misconceptions so many people just have about cannabis consumers and cannabis itself. You don't need me to tell you the effect that a century of propaganda has had stigmatizing cannabis, including medical cannabis even. So we've got to do everything we can to try to stem the tide of that prejudice and promote a good impression that people will have about our this relatively benign natural herb.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. Do you have time for two more questions?
Yes, I do.
Awesome. So one is California specific. Something that I don't think gets a lot of time in the press and media is how does this water issue interact with, the growth of the cannabis industry and, if 2016, if California goes fully recreational, is that a potential issue or roadblock for the movement?
That water issue is a canard that anti-marijuana people have been trying to foist on the public. Realize there are some very powerful forces out there who just hate us and everything we stand for. Law enforcement is a good example. They, for their own reasons, really don't like cannabis and will fight with every fiber of their being to try to prevent good laws from taking effect. Well, the drought is a big issue in California and some other Western states. Cannabis, of course, is an agricultural crop. So they're trying to say that it uses water and somehow that's harmful. Yes, it's an agricultural crop. Yes, it uses some water. However, California NORML has done some great research showing the minuscule amount of water that the cannabis crop consumes relative to many other agricultural products in California. Whether it is grapes, whether it is lettuce, whether it is walnuts or almonds, my gosh, whether it is the dairy industry, the egg industry, the chicken industry, and by far the one that uses more than any other is the meat industry. You're using, for a single serving of a hamburger, about 650 times more water than you're using to possess a single joint.
Wow.
One single serving of each of those two substances has a factor of water used that is 650 times more. So this is just put things in perspective. I mentioned California NORML. They've got two charts that people can find with bar graphs showing the amount of water being used for some of those other things I mentioned, beef, chicken, eggs, milk, walnuts, etc. And then it goes down to some other crops. All the way at the bottom, the bar graph for cannabis is so small you can barely even see it. It's barely even a blip relative to things like the meat industry and the amount of water they use.
Wow.
So, relatively speaking, the amount of water we use in the cannabis industry is negligible. There are plenty of other agricultural products that use far more. And if people want to save water during this drought, they could do a whole lot more other ways to change their behavior than trying to alter the way that we farm cannabis. Quite frankly, if you've got an acre of land that's being used for cannabis farming, it's using a whole lot less water than almost any other agricultural crop you'd mention.
Awesome. And the last question I'll ask is regarding the carers bill that's been put out that to reschedule cannabis as a Schedule II drug. Personally, I don't think that's sufficient by any means. In fact, I don't even know if that's a step in the right direction, because if we get that passed, we might get stuck there. But obviously you have expertise in the law, and I'm curious what your take on that is.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Quite frankly, cannabis is a natural substance. It's really an herb. It ought to be taken off the list of controlled substances entirely. That's where it belongs. It doesn't belong certainly doesn't belong on Schedule I, where it is now, but it also doesn't really fit into the requirements for Schedule 2, 3, 4, or 5. It is something that ought to be regulated perhaps as a nutraceutical, dietary supplement, an herb. Maybe it ought to be regulated in some way to generate money for the government because there's consumers who are willing to pay for it. But quite frankly, regulating it as if it were a pharmaceutical substance doesn't quite fit in. And I don't think it'll get us where we want to. If you remember, one of the things I mentioned earlier, we want to try to put effort into moving in the correct direction. I have one example right there. Yeah, Schedule 2 is better than Schedule 1. Sure, marginally that is true. But on the other hand, 25 years from now, being in Schedule 2 or even Schedule 5 is not going to get us where we want to be when, frankly, marijuana should not be scheduled at all. It is a beneficial, natural herb, and it ought to be treated like one.
Absolutely. Well, with that, Rob, I just want to thank you again for your time and for sharing the wisdom with me and my audience. I'm wondering if you have any last thoughts or last words.
Well, thank you. Marijuana is a racist term to begin with. The correct scientific term is cannabis. The medical term is cannabis. The English word is hemp. Marijuana is just a slang, Mexican term, derogatory word, so that the drug warriors in the 19 teens, 20s, and 30s could try to make it illegal. People weren't really sure what this new product, marijuana, even was. And there was a reason. If they tried to outlaw something they were all familiar with, like hemp, they wouldn't have succeeded. Or a medicine they were all familiar with, like cannabis, they wouldn't have succeeded. The war on drugs, was a fraud from the beginning. It was perpetrated for those racist purposes, and it was perpetrated to try to promote some of the least beneficial elements of our economy and our society. It's taken way too many decades for the public to finally catch up with that. But I think it's important to remember how it is that we got here. It has nothing to do with the relevant characteristics of this beneficial substance, cannabis. Everything to do with power and money. So keep in mind where the actual power is. Keep in mind when you're hearing some of that propaganda, what the source of it is. And I think people need to know what the actual facts are with respect to this substance. Don't buy in to a lot of that propaganda. And one of the things we can do, I think, as activists is not even to employ some of those lies that the other side has tried to foist upon people. I just see it so often. You hear a lie so often that what we try to do is adjust for it. But in the process, we're almost giving credence to the underlying expectation with that big lie. So let's try to keep our own rhetoric in a good direction and try to help fight injustice, change the society every way we can. The time is now, and I think we ought to make good use with every single second we've got.